Hi everybody, my name is Yana Demidova and today I'm going to be talking to you about my study entitled, Is the Customer Always Right? Exploring the Prevalence of Sexual Harassment Experienced by Female Servers in BC's Restaurant Industry. And my supervisor for this project was Dr. Petra Jonas, who I want to thank for all of her support and guidance because I definitely would not have been able to do this without her. So I also just want to acknowledge that even though we are online, Kwantlen stands on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tawasin, Kaykat, and Coquitlam peoples. So to preface my study, I wanted to talk a little bit about my literature review and British Columbia's restaurant industry. So British Columbia employs over 174,000 employees, 81% of which are female. Although these numbers might be different due to the COVID-19 pandemic and layoffs and business closures. We can see that the restaurant industry is very dominated by females, and typically they do take up front of house positions, so they're more likely to work as servers, bartenders, front desk, and they're more likely to deal with customers. In Canada, 1 in every 5 youth between the ages of 15 to 24 are employed in the restaurant industry, so we can also see that the majority of servers are likely to be young, in their 20s, in their teens. Overall, this job is pretty precarious in nature, and this is due to tipping culture and the tipping structures that exist in most restaurants. So liquor servers in British Columbia currently earn $13.95, which is less than the minimum wage and significantly less than the current price of living, which is around $20.64. So you can see how servers definitely rely on tips from customers to earn a livable wage. Most restaurants follow tipping structures such as tipping out and tipping pools. So this means that servers, regardless of if they earn a tip from the customer or not, they have to give a percentage of their sales to support staff and to management. So if they don't receive a tip from a customer, they're essentially losing money on that service interaction. This grants power to customers as they're taking on the employer function of essentially paying the server. You can see how the server would act way more subservient to the customer and maybe put up with more inappropriate behavior since they're so eager to earn this tip from the customer. This allows for more inappropriate customer behavior such as sexual harassment to occur. So a brief definition of sexual harassment. Overall, there is kind of a blurry definition. Canada's Labour Code defines it as any conduct, comment, gesture, or contact of a sexual nature that is likely to cause offense of humiliation to any employee. However, even this detailed definition does not provide a list of behaviors. Legal cases have highlighted sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination, with the key word as having to be unwelcome. But once again, this paves the road for so many behaviors. Unwelcome flirting, is that sexual harassment? Unwelcome staring. It kind of is up to the interpretation of the harasser and the one being harassed. So this lack of clear definition in milder forms creates confusion. So like I mentioned, flirting, catcalling, whistling, staring, are those sexual harassment? So blurred boundaries also often exist in restaurant environments as sexual commentary is normalized between coworkers and management. Often this is due to the already sexualized environment that exists in many restaurant environments due to aesthetic labor. Also, younger staff could have a lot to do with it as well. Often sexualized commentary is just very normalized in this industry. So typically sexual harassment is not a singular occurrence for service workers. Matulowicz actually conducted 2 great studies, which I based some of my literature review on, and she found that servers were likely to report that harassment is just part of the job and kind of the price to pay for being a female in this industry, which actually corroborates a lot of our findings, which I'll discuss a little bit later. So repeated victimization results in worsening effects on the victim, such as worry, anger, avoiding places, and changing behaviors. So we can see how this is kind of an uncomfortable job if you're experiencing this quite often. This then leads to burnout and can contribute to the high turnover rate of staff. Often, it's easier for management to just completely replace one of their employees rather than provide proper support and formal paperwork for a sexual harassment case. They'd rather have their employee just quit instead of hire somebody new, and instead hire somebody new. A really interesting finding is that a negative first experience working at a restaurant increases the likelihood that women will come to expect sexual harassment in other work environments. So we can see how serious some of these consequences are, considering how young and impressionable often service staff are, since they're often just teenagers. If sexual harassment is something they experience regularly and it's never taken seriously, it kind of paints the message that this is something to be expected just as a female in general, which shouldn't be the case. So a brief overview of existing literature. Although we're focusing on tipping structures, an overly sexualized work environment is definitely a contributing factor. And this is done by dress codes, sexualized hiring practices, and physical features of the restaurant environment, such as sexualized music and dim lighting. Power dynamics are also created by tipping structure, and a lot of the studies in my literature review discuss this power triangle where the server is at the bottom and the customer and the management kind of take on roles since they share like the responsibility of essentially paying the server. The server has to act subservient to both and has this obligation to provide excellent customer service no matter what the customer is doing to them. And then this creates this reluctance to report harassment, since often management is acting subservient in ways to the customer, since they want good reviews and they want return clientele. So this led me to my research question. What is the nature and extent of sexual harassment from customers experienced by female servers in British Columbia, and how is this issue connected to features of the workplace, of the restaurant as a workplace? So the reason I wanted to study this as well is because I actually am a server as well, and I myself experience minor forms of sexual harassment almost daily, and I find myself putting up with it often just out of convenience. It's often very inconvenient to report it to a manager, and I would lose the tip from the customer, and I rely on these tips as my primary source of income. This all led me to my hypothesis that most servers would be willing to put up with some forms of harassment due to the reliance on customer tips. So moving on to methodology. So this study was exploratory in nature. Our inclusion criteria were self-identified female servers currently employed in a full-service restaurant in BC. This was a two-stage study. So we had an online survey run through SurveyMonkey and a qualitative audio interview run through Microsoft Teams. We recruited participants online through posters initially, and then we also used snowball sampling, especially for the interview stage. So we gathered 65 participants for the survey stage. And the survey, we didn't necessarily define sexual harassment, but rather we listed behaviors, and participants could choose the frequency that they experience these behaviors and the frequency in which they report these behaviors. At the end of the survey, they had the option to enroll into our interview stage. In turn, they would receive a $20 Starbucks gift card, but they were made aware that they would lose some anonymity to the researchers, since I would then know what their email address was. Although we took all precautions to ensure confidentiality and data protection, we managed to find 8 participants through snowball sampling. We also used purposive sampling for the interview stage. So those who did consent to the interview, they also had to check off that they did experience sexual harassment, as we wanted to gather the experience of those that have experienced these behaviors rather than the lower number of servers that we found did not experience them. When coding the data, we used a content analysis approach. So I had a list of a priori codes for the interview. So I did an initial coding, and then I did a second coding for emergent themes. For the survey stage, I just gathered descriptive statistics. So the interview could complement this descriptive data that we had collected. Some ethical considerations: the study was deemed as minimal risk by the REB, but of course there was a potential risk of triggering participants as they are describing sexual harassment, which could be a touchy subject. We did list counseling services in the consent form, and participants were made known their right to withdraw, so they could withdraw during the study, and then they could withdraw their data up to 2 weeks after the interview stage. We used third-party platforms. So there was a potential risk of data breaches, although both the platforms met all Canadian privacy law standards. We stored the data locally after we had completed the data collection, and then we are going to delete this data as soon as my project is fully complete. We took all precautions to ensure anonymity and confidentiality as much as possible throughout the study. There was a small conflict of interest since I did publish the study on my own social medias. I know a lot of people in the industry, and a lot of them are my coworkers, so they might have participated in the survey stage, although I would never know who they were. And a few participated in my interview stage, but they were made to know that their names would never be published in my actual thesis, and their identities would not be known. There was just the potential that they might feel uncomfortable sharing with me. But I let them know their right to withdraw, and they could withdraw their data up to 2 weeks afterwards. Moving on to the exciting part, the results. So most surveys found that harassment is the price to pay for working in the industry. So 75% of survey respondents have said that they've experienced sexual harassment, as well as all 8 of our interview participants. Over 97% of our survey respondents actually checked off that they've experienced at least one of the behaviors we've listed at some point in their surveying career. 67% of participants believe that sexual harassment is an expected part of working as a female server, which is actually a very large emergent theme in our interview. All interview participants talked about how it's so normalized, and they experience at least minor forms of harassment almost every shift that they work. The most common behaviors we found were staring, commentary on appearance, and asking for personal information. So one quote that sums this up is, "No one applies to be a server and doesn't expect to experience at least some form of harassment. It's just part of the job," which seems to be a common theme amongst everybody we interviewed. So moving on to forms of harassment. So flirting was experienced by all of our interview participants, and although some reported discomfort, most were willing to engage in this behavior, as the common assumption is that it will be rewarded through a higher tip at the end of the service. Some servers noted that this isn't always a bad thing. Servers note that harmless banter and flirting is sometimes enjoyable. It's how they build return clientele. It's how they make friends in the industry. Although not all interview participants reported this, some do say they feel uncomfortable flirting, but they just don't want to report it because it's not serious enough, or they know that they're going to get a higher tip out of it. So one quote in regard to this behavior: "There have been times where I just know that they're going to tip good if I can put up with whatever they're saying and just kind of go along with it. There are times where it's either like you might be flirty back or just being more attentive to that specific table because you know you're going to be getting a bigger tip out of it." So as the server said, like, she might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but she feels that if they're flirting with her, they like her, they're going to leave her a larger tip. So why would she go report this to a management? She'd rather like put up with the discomfort of flirting with the table because she knows she's going to be rewarded through that tip. And if she lost the tip, she would essentially be losing her wages. So asking for personal information was more of an emergent theme in our interview. In our survey, only 43% identified this as a sexual harassment behavior. However, all 8 of our interview participants said that this was an important boundary violation, as when they experience asking for personal information, the harassment extends into their personal life, and it's no longer just a workplace discomfort. So a quote that summarizes this: when they start asking about your own personal information, such as social media, that's when I feel like it's becoming a little bit too hard, because it's no longer going to be just that one night that you're serving them. Once they have your personal information, you know that it's going to be a constant thing where they're just trying to continue to reach out to you, even if we only put up with it because we wanted the tip at the end of the night. So we can definitely see how this is a boundary violation as it extends into their personal life, but it's also behavior that isn't really harassment or blatantly harassment, and is kind of hard to report to a manager. Inappropriate touching was another emergent theme. We hadn't really focused on this in our survey nor interview stage, as touching kind of extends more towards the sexual assault side of things, although all of our interview participants discussed this as a major boundary violation, and we even had survey participants write this in our open text box as well, that this is a form of sexual harassment that they would report to a manager. No interview participant said that they would put up with this for a tip. So this is definitely where people would draw the line. And we kind of had mixed results on the prevalence of inappropriate touching because of the pandemic. So some surveys said that touching has gone down in frequency since customers are being asked to socially distance. But we had a few participants say that they experienced touching quite frequently, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, with customers grabbing their hand, grabbing their shoulder, touching their waist. So commentary on appearance and staring were both emergent themes of desensitization. So these two behaviors, servers reported that they don't even really bat an eye anymore when they experience it. Staring wasn't even really identified as harassment by 33% of our participants, even though 23% of our participants said that they experience this every shift. Commentary on appearance was only reported if it was explicitly sexual. So overall, to summarize the behaviors, it seems as though servers only really report harassment when it's explicitly sexual in nature, and they're more likely to put up with verbal harassment due to tipping culture. Asking for personal information and touching were definitely boundaries and were more likely to be reported. So the most common response was to put up with harassment rather than to report it, as a tip would not be lost, even though the server might face discomfort. So 69% of our participants reported not reporting harassment due to expecting a high tip. One server said, if it was up to me, I would love to stop serving a customer, but I guess I really just have to judge the extent of the harassment, because that is how it is, unfortunately, as you do rely on those tips for income and things like that. So you can kind of see like the divide in the server, like they don't really want to serve this customer, but it's part of their job since the customer is deciding their wage. So they kind of have to outweigh it. Like, do they want to make a larger amount of money this day, or do they want to report the harassment, maybe be more comfortable, but they'll lose their tip? So in regard to management, only 58% of participants have ever reported harassment to a manager, although 97% of our participants have experienced at least one of the behaviors we've listed. So you can kind of see it's not normalized to talk to your manager about harassment, and it was also found that management was likely to turn a blind eye towards harassment. This is due to normalization. A really interesting emergent theme we found is that some servers talked about how a lot of their managers used to be servers in the past, and they've experienced harassment their whole time in the industry. So when they do step up into that management role, they don't really consider behaviors such as flirting and commentary on appearance as a severe harassing behavior, or one that is important enough to kick out a customer for or write a report about. 35% of servers reported a loss of trust in management after experiencing harassment because management did not take it seriously enough or do anything to stop the harassment. There was a theme of prioritizing sales and return clientele. Since customers have so much power, they could leave a negative Yelp review or tell their friends. Word of mouth is so important when it comes to restaurants that management might be more likely to kind of almost punish the server for reporting harassment or do something in their power to keep the customer happy rather than try and make their staff more comfortable. An interesting emergent theme we had with a few of our interview participants was that they had supportive management, which is great. So they felt very comfortable reporting harassment to their manager, and they felt as though the management would take the appropriate steps to deal with the customer's inappropriate behavior. Although this was not the case for everybody, and most of the literature does corroborate the blind eye side of management. So moving on to sexualized work environments in regard to dress codes, 73% of participants reported having a dress code, with 66% also experiencing strict expectations for appearance. Many surveys reported this implicit pressure to dress in a sexualized way, so their dress code wasn't necessarily sexual, but they felt as though they had to sexualize themselves either for a higher tip or because it was normalized in their workplace. So we also found that female appearance was more likely to be policed as compared to male coworkers. Um, so females had stricter implicit expectations as well as stricter expectations written out in their dress code as compared to male coworkers. An interesting quote about implicit pressure: I guess a lot of the girls, considering where I work, feel obligated to dress like in short skirts and things like that to get more attention from the customers and to get better tips. Like, for example, we're allowed to wear pants, but I don't think a single server here does. We all feel very pressured to wear skirts, and that's definitely a big contributor. So as the server says, her dress code isn't necessarily sexualized. In British Columbia, it's illegal to force a server to wear heels, but you might go to some restaurants where every server is wearing heels and a short skirt. This is due to the pressure of aesthetic labor and how often customers come into certain establishments expecting to see attractive servers, how management might implicitly pressure you into dressing more attractively, and how once you start at an establishment where everybody's dressing provocatively, like you might feel the pressure to dress that way as well. In regard to appearance, interview participants noted how appearance could actually be used to attain higher tips, and that looks do matter in a restaurant environment. An interesting quote regarding this: I knew that I would make more money if I wore a full face of makeup, and I did use that to my advantage. However, there is that, that societal beauty standard that we're held accountable to, and to reinforce that can be very dangerous, especially for people who struggle with low self-esteem or low self-worth. So to kind of have that, reinforced by the idea that, oh, I'm not even good at my job unless I look good, can be very dangerous. And I found that this interview participant was so insightful. It is so damaging to a young girl entering the industry, knowing that if one day she doesn't wear makeup, she's not going to be compensated as much through tips. She's not going to be looked at in the same way, treated the same way. Servers might actually come to expect harassment in some form, which kind of creates this toxic relationship because, if you dress more provocatively, you might get higher tips. You are going to be harassed more. You're going to put up with this harassment to earn more money. And you can see how it's kind of this double-edged sword working in the industry, how servers might feel pressured to kind of adhere to these appearance standards, even though it might create discomfort. Customer intoxication was another emergent theme. So we found that harassment was much more prevalent during night shifts, and a higher level of harassment was reported from intoxicated customers, which the two go hand in hand. People are more likely to be drinking during the night, especially in liquor serving establishments such as bars. Interview participants reported a fear of interacting with intoxicated customers due to kind of the unreliability of the interactions. You don't really know how an intoxicated customer is going to act. There's also this blame kind of put on the server for over-serving alcohol. So in BC, there's a responsible service program, and servers aren't supposed to serve more than a certain amount of ounces to a customer. So if they have served that much to a customer, then reporting this to the management might blame them for serving them too much alcohol. So the server might just want to put up with the behavior until the customer is done. A quote that captured this: since we are a liquor serving establishment, I think that plays into the fact that when liquor is involved, customers who are under the influence, and since they're paying, feel a sense of entitlement that they can do this to servers, even though that's not the case. I definitely think liquor plus the fact that attractive servers are serving you could play into it. And just as this participant said, it's a multitude of factors. It's the sexualized work environment. It's the entitlement that customers may feel since they're leaving a tip. Plus intoxication. Once all these factors are mixed in, it's interesting to see the pressure that could be put onto the server to put up with all of these behaviors because of all of these factors influencing them. So the effects of harassment, 83% of our participants said that they avoid customers that harass them. They feel uncomfortable serving them. Over 50% say they change their body language, they feel angry, and they fear future victimization. Our interview participants found discomfort and anxiety as the most common feelings they experience. Embarrassment was another emergent theme, with many noting the spotlight effect is cast upon them, especially when serving larger parties. Since they're standing in front of a table serving multiple people, they feel pressured to respond in certain ways when they're being harassed. Self-blame was another emergent theme. So one participant said, especially now when I look back at it, I'm like, I could have put an end to it, or I could have stopped it right then and there, but I also kind of went along with it. So partially it's on me. This server feels self-blame for not reporting or stopping harassment, although she shouldn't feel this way because harassment is not her fault. Being harassed was not her fault. The customer was doing this to her, but she feels like it's her obligation to either put up with it, stop it, or tell a manager, even though these all might be negative kind of experiences for her, since harassment shouldn't be happening in the first place. In regard to the COVID-19 pandemic, we found no change in the prevalence or frequency of harassment. Instead, we found a change in the form of harassment. Most participants said that harassment was less sexual in nature and more restriction-based, so had more to do with mask mandates, social distancing, limitation to the amount of people you could have in your party. Servers have to now police customers more into following current health guidelines, which could be met with like reluctance and retaliation from customers, which can then be seen as harassment, but not necessarily sexual harassment. Moving on to the discussion. So overall, we found that organizations fail to prevent and deal with harassment both at a corporate level and an individual location-based managerial level. So most organizations don't take adequate prevention measures, nor do they deal with harassment adequately when it is reported, which leads to uncomfortable situations for servers and the overall normalization of sexual harassment. We found that, of course, gender has a lot to do with it, since 81% of the restaurant industry is dominated by females, and traditionally, the harasser is male. This was found by Shoup's 2020 study on gender-based power. The harasser is often male in restaurant establishments. Tipping culture plays a huge role in creating pressures. Fear of no tip was the #1 reason for not reporting to a manager. And power dynamics were reinforced by structures where tipping out is required, since servers don't want to leave at the end of the day losing money. Appearance was, of course, a really great contributing factor towards all of this. So Wadby and Polston found that work environment cues encourage staff to customize appearance as they deem fit. So thinking back to the quote where that server said, they're allowed to wear pants, but nobody does, servers are going to continue to sexualize themselves if a sexualized work environment is so normalized. Customers then come to expect this. The spotlight is put on how the server is appearing rather than the quality of the service, the quality of the food. Restaurants should be about the quality of food, the quality of service, but often they're not. Kingston in 2012 found that women's bodies are becoming a central theme for many restaurant establishments in North America. We see this through the popular American chain Hooters, where they have an extremely sexualized uniform. You don't see many people going to Hooters because they love the food, you know? Women's bodies are just as important, if not more important, in establishments like that, rather than the food, which restaurants used to be all about. Intoxication is an aggravating factor. Sexual harassment is one possible outcome of excessive alcohol consumption, and typically restaurants such as Hooters, they prioritize alcohol sales as well, even often more than food sales. Like I've mentioned, it's the combination of all of these factors that creates pressures and power dynamics that allow for sexual harassment to occur. Management was found to de facto legitimize customer abuse for a variety of different reasons. Um, so as discussed, often management is desensitized to harassment just as much as servers are, since they used to be servers in the past. They don't take harassment as seriously. Often it might be too much of a hassle or too much of a bother for management to file formal complaints. So they'd rather have their staff leave, because serving is essentially a job that requires little to no experience, and the role can easily be filled again. Often the cons of reporting harassment outweigh the positives for a server, hence the reluctance to report. Reporting harassment might lead to a management thinking the server is too sensitive, a reduction in hours, worse sections if they think the server can't handle the customers. We had overall mixed results for the supportiveness of management, although most literature corroborates how management typically takes on this brushing off approach towards harassment. Overall, the consequences, overall serving is found to be kind of an uncomfortable job. The implicit pressures create this discomfort. Overall, there was an unclear definition as to what is and isn't serious enough to be considered harassment. Servers are reluctant to report. Multiple studies have found that sexual harassment acts as a stressor that impacts psychological well-being, which can lead to burnout and, once again, leads to the high turnover rate. So our recommendations are that tipping power dynamics can be mitigated through changes such as an automatic gratuity added to each bill. Servers wouldn't necessarily have to tip out to the restaurant. They know that every customer they serve is going to be leaving them a tip. Therefore, they're not going to be putting up with inappropriate customer behavior. And they'll be providing the same service to every customer. Although customers might retaliate, I don't think the public would necessarily like an automatic gratuity, as I feel as though a lot of customers like customizing their tip based on the quality of service they receive. The issue with this, though, is sometimes people might tip based on the server's attractiveness or the server's reluctance to engage in flirting. So preventative sexual harassment training also needs to be implemented upon hiring, as well as frequent workshops and an encouragement to report. The normalization of harassment needs to be stopped, and it seems as though restaurants don't discuss this with their staff often enough. If there was a zero tolerance policy for harassment, servers wouldn't feel the need to put up with this, but clearly based on our results, servers still do, which means management isn't taking enough precautions to stop harassment before it even occurs. I discussed this a little further in my literature review, but British Columbia doesn't have a clear formal reporting system for workplace sexual harassment, and this can be really intimidating for a young employee. So if BC made this more approachable, I think more people would be willing to report serious cases of harassment. Participants in the interview stage noted that societal change is necessary, and I definitely agree. With things such as the Me Too movement happening, people felt more comfortable sharing their cases of sexual assault, sexual harassment. However, it's hard to say what exactly can be done to encourage this societal change. Some limitations of the study: due to snowball sampling, participants may have worked at similar establishments, meaning a lack of restaurant diversity. So smaller chains might experience different harassment than bars or like large corporate chains. So it'd be interesting to see the differences different types of establishment may experience, because a brunch place might not see the same type of clientele that a late night bar does. Our study also had a relatively small sample size, so this could definitely be extended towards the whole province of British Columbia, or even a nationwide study to see how prevalent harassment is in the service industry in general. Although this study was about genders were not compared, so it'd be really interesting to see how male servers experience harassment, because I'm sure they do, but to a different extent and to a different degree. We also kind of had a broad scope. Although we focused on tipping structure, we incorporated a lot of important factors that all play into sexual harassment. An interesting study could be applying a narrow focus to just one of the factors, such as dress codes, or even comparing different types of tipping structures in order to see which is more effective in preventing sexual harassment. Overall, our study still had really interesting findings, and I hope you enjoyed listening to my presentation. I look forward to hearing any questions you might have for me. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.